All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to FWMD Live. And today we're going to have an important conversation about anti-Semitism in medicine, education, and also in public settings. I'm Prescott Stokes III, the Integrated Content and Marketing Manager here at the TCU and UNT HSC School of Medicine. And today I'm happy to be here with Dr. Yvonne Kaplan-Liss.
Thanks, Prescott and everyone. I'm really happy to be here.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan-Liss. Now, I just want to say that Dr. Kaplan-Liss is actually the Assistant Dean for Narrative, Reflection, and Patient Communication here at the School of Medicine. And she also leads the Compassionate Practice, which is the communication portion of our curriculum here at the medical school. And today, for our conversation, we also have two very special guests joining us. Our first guest is LENORE PEARLSTEIN.
Good afternoon, Prescott. Thank you for having me, and thank you to TCU Medical School for hosting this important topic.
All right. Thank you, LENORE. Now, LENORE is actually the owner and founder of Insight into Diversity magazine that actually focuses on higher education. Now, our second guest is Vlad Hyken.
Hi there. Very happy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you, Vlad. I want to say that Vlad actually works for the ADL, an anti-hate organization that was founded in 1913 in response to an escalating climate of anti-Semitism. Today, the ADL continues to fight all forms of hate, and Vlad is the National Director of Programs on Anti-Semitism. Now, before we get to the discussion with our panelists, I want to take this time to let you guys know that we have another special element happening today. We're going to have three of our first-year medical students, and the first is HANNA MAKK.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you, Hannah. And our second student will be PAIGE Miller.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, too.
And last but never least, Ilana Zago.
Thank you so much, Prescott. It's so great to be here.
All right, thank you all for joining us. Now, what's going to happen today is that Hannah will talk to us about her meeting with our diversity and inclusion team about why she wanted to have this discussion, because she prompted us to have this discussion during our FWMD live chat. And also PAIGE and Ilana will share two very short poems that actually touches on their ancestry and Holocaust survivors. So this is going to be a jam-packed hour today. And now we're going to begin with a poem from PAIGE. PAIGE, you have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Prescott. And so I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see a quilt I made in honor of a Holocaust survivor, Lily Bialar. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about her story. So I'll read a little bit about her story and then share the reflection on why I made the quilt the way it is. So Lily Bialar was 14 years old when the Nazis started bombing her town in Poland the day before she started 8th grade on September 1st, 1939. Lily grew up in a shtetl, a little provincial town, as a happy child, the youngest of 6 children, in a loving and observant Jewish family. Never did she dream of the nightmare that was supposed to be her life for the next 6 years during World War II. She escaped the hands of the Nazis and then survived starvation and illness in Siberian labor camps for several years. And after the war, Lily continued on, resilient and especially positive. She glowed with love and admiration for her family and friends, always finding the good in them. Even later in life, when other difficulties befell her, she didn't dwell on the negative, never played the victim, and lived with the faith that tomorrow would be a better day. In darkness, she found light, and if you were down, she picked you up. So, in memory and honor of Lily Bialar, I decided to create a hanging quilt that embodies the attributes of Lily. I specifically chose to create a quilt because it symbolizes warmth, which I thought perfectly complements Lily's warm and happy demeanor. In my quilt, I decided to use a variety of shades of blue fabrics and place them on my quilt, going from the dark shades on one side to the light shades on the other. I did this to show that despite the dark and gloomy circumstances Lily faced, she was still able to find light in her world through her cheery and positive attitude. On the back side of the quilt, I purposely used bright yellow fabric to represent how Lily glowed with love and admiration. In addition, I personally connected with Lily's story when I discovered that she had passed away on January 26 of 2012. Ironically, this is my birthday. So now when I celebrate my birthday, I simultaneously celebrate her life and legacy. Thank you so much for letting me share.
Thank you so much for that, Paige. That was beautiful. We also got some comments already while you were reading from some of your classmates. Emma DeFore says, yay, go classmates. And Ben Jacob says he's proud of all you guys. So next we're gonna have a poem from Ilana Zago. So Ilana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Prescott, and thank you, Paige, for sharing such a beautiful piece with us. The following poem is very near to my heart. I actually wrote it as a reflection on the Jewish fast day of Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, which we actually observed last month. And this fast day does mark the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. It's when we mourn the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And going forward in Jewish history, many additional tragedies have actually happened around this day, such as the expulsion of Jews from England, France, and Spain, as well as the beginning of World War I and the approval of the final solution during World War II. And so to commemorate this fast day, we read from the Book of Lamentations. And this book contains the story of the 10 martyrs. And these were 10 Jewish sages that were brutally executed during the Roman Empire. And this story is really a representation of the horrendous crimes that have been committed against the Jewish people, motivated by nothing more than anti-Semitism. And it is in their memory, as well as those that have perished throughout history, simply because they were Jewish, that inspired me to write this poem. And this is my history. 10 martyrs. The destruction of their holy temple now completed, burnt to ashes, melted gold atop sapphire robes, bronze mirrors become worthless. Scrolls with words they had believed in, taken only for their value, no consideration to the legacy they served, or the place they held in history. Taken by an undeserving crowd. 10 martyrs, the destruction of their holy land now completed. No longer does milk and honey taste sweet, nor does rain fall in a territory of captivity. 10 martyrs, their lives not taken with a quick blow of the axe or a crack of the neck, their lives taken, one wept while another was beheaded. This weeping would not be stood for. His skin peeled off, his pulse still felt. One's skin was raked with iron combs while he was proclaiming, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. 10 martyrs, one bound in a Torah scroll, wet wool in his chest set on fire. 10 martyrs, 1,580,000, 6 million. Yet I am part of a minority group, driven apart, exiled. Yet I am a Jew. Jude, Kaik, Heb, Yid, yet these words don't knock me to my knees, cause my hands to shake or my eyes to twitch. They remind me of what we had to face together, reassures me wherever I am taken, I will never be far from the millions who went before me. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ilana. That was also beautiful as well, very touching. What I want to say to everyone is that if you have any questions about anti-Semitism, medical ethics, you can get into the comments, leave your question, and then I will make sure that Dr. Captain Liss, Vlad, and Lenore can give you some feedback. But before we get to those questions and the bulk of our discussion, Hannah, I want you to tell us what prompted you to go to our diversity and inclusion team and ask them to have this conversation in a public forum.
Thank you so much, Prescott, for that question. And thank you, Lana, for sharing. And thank you as well, Paige. Unfortunately, what motivated me to bring this conversation to the forefront of our collective consciousness was really a controversy that took place a few weeks ago. It was when high-profile NFL player Deshaun Jackson posted to his nearly 1.2 million followers on Instagram a quote which, among other things, and I quote, stated that Hitler was right about the Jews. This quote was taken from an anti-Semitic book which, among others, reinforces the conspiracy theory that Jewish people are evil, false, control the government, and are scheming to take over the world. I was even further disappointed by his painfully ignorant apology, in which he claimed that anyone who believed this comment was anti-Semitic simply misinterpreted him. My first reaction really was anger. Anger in today's day and age that someone in such an influential position would so confidently and loudly proclaim such anti-Semitic rhetoric. But truly, my second inclination, which speaks to this conversation, is curiosity. I was really curious about how many people, however less confident or loud, really hold the same stereotypes and feelings about Jewish people. So much so that Mr. Jackson felt it really an inconsequential statement to make. This was really when I first began to think of the connotations of ignorance and how by allowing it to go unchallenged, we are usurping an exquisite opportunity to prevent the hatred that it causes. I mean, as a Jew myself, I really am the benefactor of the effort of many people in the Jewish community who have worked tirelessly in preserving Judaism as a culture and keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, as a reminder of the ultimate product of ignorance, intolerance, and hatred. So I kind of see it as my responsibility and the responsibility of every educated individual to never allow ignorance to go unchallenged and to continue a legacy that meets ignorance without anger, but instead with truth, rationale, and logic. So I'm proud of my Jewish heritage, and I am so thankful for my institution for taking initiative and really hosting this conversation and taking on the mantle of combating the ignorance of anti-Semitism head on. So I am so proud and grateful to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah. You know, as we begin this conversation, back in June, we had a similar conversation about racism. And so, Vlad, I want you to just start with anti-Semitism and help us understand exactly what it is, because I think what Hannah said and what frustrated her the most was the ignorance. And so maybe you can help clear the air as we begin this conversation, just explaining to us exactly what anti-Semitism is.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much, and thank you for to the medical school for hosting this really important event. Thanks to Hannah for taking the initiative to really get this going. So when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about really an ancient hatred, right? Scholars don't have a good sense of, how it originated, but it does have a history several thousand years old, extending back into antiquity. Today, it is a phenomenon that infects around 1/4 of the world's population, according to our research. And it is also a phenomenon that has been growing over the last 5 to 6 years, with 2019 actually having the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record that we've ever tracked. It's also a phenomenon that motivates a majority of hate crimes that target individuals or institutions on the basis of religion. Around 58% of anti-religious hate crimes target the Jewish community. When we're talking about a definition of anti-Semitism, definitions can be fraught, but a basic definition is that anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice or discrimination that is directed towards Jews, either as individuals, as a group, their institutions, their culture, their way of life, etc. It's based on age-old stereotypes and myths that target the Jews as a people, their religious practices, etc. And in that sense, it's similar to other forms of bigotry, racism, homophobia, as you mentioned. These, and of course, in that sense, they can have, of course, a pernicious effect on care for Jewish patients. But even as all of these forms of bigotry are interconnected, inextricably, I would say, interconnected, we have to understand them not only in their commonalities, the things that they share in common with one another, but also in their particularities. And what is particular to anti-Semitism is that it manifests as a conspiracy theory, right, as Hannah mentioned. And it's specifically a conspiracy theory that alleges to be punching up at its targets rather than punching down. What do I mean by that? So whereas the racist considers the target of their bigotry to be inferior to them in most ways. To the anti-Semite, the Jew is supernaturally powerful, right? We've heard these tropes before, able to control the global media, nations, the banking industry, even able to control the weather, we've heard, right? And I think this allows Jews to become a kind of scapegoat for any and every ill in society, whether that's physical, social, political, environmental, or economic.
So, you know, Vlad, as you say that, and you mention the things that people list as conspiracy theories around Jewish people and Jewish culture, how do we start to see it as a problem? Because I think the point that Hannah was actually alluding to about Deshaun Jackson's comments was that he felt okay with saying it, right? And so how can we help educate people that saying these kind of things is actually a problem and it's actually negative within our country and also within our communities?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. You know, I think the first thing is that people need to realize that all of these things, as I mentioned, are interconnected, right? Anti-Semitism plays a central role in motivating white supremacist ideology, which has really come to represent the greatest domestic terror threat in the country at this moment. White supremacists have been responsible for the majority of domestic extremist murders over the last decade, right? So we have to understand anti-Semitism is part of this broader nexus. And I think, we're talking within the context of a medical school, and I think anti-Semitism has particular implications for the medical profession, the medical field, and public health more broadly. When we talk about medical ethics, for example, we have to remember that, one of the central questions of medical ethics has been around the morality of using research that was derived from experiments that were performed on Jewish inmates in Nazi concentration camps, right? And when it comes to public health matters, there's really a long history of anti-Semitism in the realm of health and disease, from Jews being blamed, for example, for the Black Plague, going all the way back to medieval times, to Jews being blamed for COVID-19 today. Anti-Semitism often acts as a misdiagnosis of social ills, and it prescribes a kind of snake oil solution, right? It's a red herring that sends people on a kind of pseudoscientific wild goose chase after Jewish boogeymen said to be the cause of this illness. And meanwhile, the wound festers, right? The cancer metastasizes and the patient dies from neglect. So, like all superstitions, anti-Semitism is really dangerous.
And so you also mentioned education, and so we're a medical school. LENORE, you run a magazine that focuses on education and the importance of diversity within higher education. So in this type of conversation, how important is it for educational institutions to invest in programs that promote social cohesion so there isn't such a division among cultures within higher education institutions?
So thank you for that question, Prescott. First of all, I'd also like to thank the 3 young women medical students. You are making an impact in this world, and I think every Jewish person around the world and every Holocaust survivor would be very proud of your words today. So thank you to each of you. I actually bring a little bit of a different perspective, not just owning a diversity magazine. I work with people of color around the country who are diversity administrators in colleges and universities. But I'm also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I do remember growing up and sort of a twofold movement. One, in that my father used to tell me about the rise of Nazi Germany, the atrocities that were committed to him personally and to his family and to others. But I also grew up in the civil rights era. So I see anti-Semitism and racism kind of in the same, having the same connection. When you talk about institutions of higher education, I think it's really important that people find allies. We're a minority just like people of color are. Jewish people are a minority just like, people of color, LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community, Middle Eastern people. So I think it's really important that you find allies in within your higher education community. We just hosted a webinar a couple of weeks ago for women of color to find allies in the community. And it was extremely well received. And I really encourage every institution of higher education to do the same for people who are of different religious beliefs, and especially the Jewish community, because we really are looking for allies and not short-term allies. We're looking for people who are going to stay there with us. They're going to have our back, and they're going to be there for the long term, not just when incidents pop up on the news, you know, one day and you're going to tell me, you're my friend, how are you doing today? I need you to be there for the long term for me, so have my back always. So I think institutions can not only educate young people and not look at the misinformation that's out there. And I can talk about that maybe a little bit later, but I think it's really important that they're able to find allies as well on college campuses.
And I think that's just such a very important point to what you said, Lenore, especially when you think about anti-Semitism and also racism. That's exactly what groups of minorities across America are essentially looking for, right? They're looking for that support from the larger American community to say that we're all one. So I do think that's a very, very important point and a very important message to kind of have out there, to have that kind of conversation happening. So what I want to do right now is just let everyone know who, if you just joined us or if you're watching, you can leave any questions you want about anti-Semitism, about medical ethics. We have Vlad from the ADL here. We have Lenore from Insight into Diversity magazine. And we also have our own Dr. Yvonne Kaplan-Liss. Leave your questions in the comments and I will definitely get you some answers. Dr. Kaplan-Liss, I want to come to you first. You handle the communications portion of our curriculum for all of our medical students, all of the wonderful young ladies that you just heard speak so eloquently will participate in this kind of communication curriculum. And so what I want you to explain for us as a Jewish woman and also as a woman who is a physician and also worked in the media prior to becoming a physician, what has your experience been like in medicine and in medical education?
Sure. Thanks, Prescott. I also want to thank our students. So proud of them and their humility and their courage, and Hannah to even bring this to the forefront when she's been in medical school for a month maybe. So I really do appreciate it. So as a Jewish woman, physician, I've never felt like a minority where I grew up. If you can't tell, I'm from New York, and the numbers prove it that New York City is one of the largest Jewish populations in the country. 9% in New York City versus 2% nationally. So even if not everybody is Jewish, I feel an understanding. I feel I'm at home. And I've never been on the receiving end of anti-Semitism, though with that, I still have a visceral reaction to anti-Semitism, to even a movie that I can't get through, Jojo Rabbit, which I know is a farce and I know is written by Jewish people. I couldn't even get through to the beginning. And that's because I knew from very young, from Hebrew school, the importance of never forgetting. And I do have that reaction. And I was recruited to come to Texas, where the population of Jewish people in Texas, I think, is 0.6%. And it opened up my eyes as a woman, but really as a Jewish person, that I have to remember what it brings back, that I should remember that I am a minority, that the Jews are a minority like other minorities. And it opened up my eyes to it in a way I hadn't seen growing up in New York. In terms of being a physician, from my perspective, being a woman was more challenging than being a Jewish physician, but that again was in the context of New York. Though when I got to Texas for the first time, I did feel a little alone. I'm used to just connecting on certain levels. And I also felt almost like a sore thumb. I was sticking out, maybe more so because of being a New Yorker than being a Jew. But to me, they're all related.
Right. another interesting thing, like when you look at studies about Jewish medical ethics, but just medicine in general, over time, Jewish people have been drawn to the study of medicine, especially in America, far out of proportion with their actual numbers, right? In America over time, maybe not so much in recent years, but if you go far enough back, a lot of Jewish people have been drawn to medicine, especially in America. So just from your perspective, why do you think that has been so much that way?
So I think that's still the perception. And when I knew we were going to be talking about this today, I did a little of my own research. And I think centuries ago, that may have been the case. I think that rabbis and the Talmud and other writings were similar for the Jewish people in terms of healing and medicine, and that was a profession they could be proud of, be financially stable from, because as a rabbi they weren't making money. That may have been the reason in centuries ago, but I think the perception is still that. And as I'm on the website, I'm actually, when I was Googling, I was surprised to see websites about, finding a Jewish doctor. How do you find a Jewish doctor? So I think that perception is still there. But when I did some digging, I saw numbers like applicants to medical school in 1930s were 60% of applicants, and in the 1980s, and it may be even lower, it was down to 9%. So 50% decrease in applicants. And also 14% of physicians are Jewish. And if you're Jewish, you have a 7 times more likely chance of being a physician. But if you look at the Hindu population, that's 26 times more likely to be a physician if you're Hindu. So I think it's changed. I think the perception, though, is still there. And I don't really have any more recent numbers on medical school applicants, but I think the trend is in that direction.
Right. And I just want to let everybody know, if you have any questions about anti-Semitism or medical ethics, just jump in the comments and leave your question, and we will definitely get you some answers. Dr. Kaplan-Liss, we had one question for you. And the question is, how should people of non-Jewish descent approach a conversation about anti-Semitism with Jewish people? And Dr. Kaplan-Liss also has a media background. She worked in media prior to becoming a physician. So what advice would you give people on having this conversation with Jewish people about anti-Semitism?
So I want to say I don't think this conversation is any different than any challenging conversation, just like in the recent Black Lives Matter discussions. I think as someone that isn't Jewish, and anybody that's not in somebody else's shoes, you can't pretend to be in somebody else's shoes. I think the first step is try to understand where that person is. Not every Jewish person is the same. They do not walk in the same shoes as each other. So just to get an understanding. But I think the first thing is to even have that conversation, not to be afraid to have it, because to be compassionate, you can be empathetic, but to be compassionate, you have to act on that empathy, and starting a conversation with somebody about it, but being in a position to understand where they're at, and going along with them, or just being with them, just being in the room with them, and not, and following their lead is the first step.
And so, Dr. Kaplan-Liss, and also Vlad, I want you to kind of jump in with this. Prior to our conversation, I did a lot of reading. I came across an essay that was written, and it kind of discussed the idea of Jewish physicians and the difficulty that they might find wearing culturally identifying things while they're working with patients. Just, Vlad, I want you to begin first. Just from that perspective, how might that create a difficult atmosphere or some sort of tension between a patient and a physician who's Jewish, who might have something on that's culturally identifying?
Yeah, thanks for that question. One thing I want to highlight is, anti-Semitism has been referred to as the canary in the coal mine, right? you know, the Samantha Power, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, you know, identified it as such. And what she meant by that was that anti-Semitism never comes for a visit alone. It always comes with a kind of entourage of anti-intellectualism, contempt for knowledge, learning for scholarship, contempt for expertise. And in the last number of years, we've seen this kind of growth of anti-Semitism that has been really accompanied by this sort of anti-intellectual stream in, you know, these conspiracy theories, this disrespect for expertise, for medical expertise, for epidemiologists, for other medical professionals. And I think, you know, as we were, you know, talking, the medical profession has for a long time been linked to Jews, and this sort of erosion of respect for scholarship and expertise has really led to a lack of a respect, and in fact a contempt for Jewish physicians certainly, and for the medical profession more broadly. We've seen this, for example, in Nazi Germany. They published children's books that talked about Jews as a threat, Jewish doctors specifically as a threat to their patients, right? In the Soviet Union, anyone who's you know, familiar with Russian history knows about the doctor's plot, right? Which under Stalin kind of spread these conspiracy theories that the people who have, you know, taken an oath, in fact, to defend human life, are actually part of a conspiracy to harm us, to assassinate Soviet leadership, to undermine the nation. So when we're talking about, you know, for Jews wearing, you know, cultural garb that identifies them as Jewish, in an atmosphere of this kind of distrust for Jews and for the medical professional, for, you know, physicians, for medical expertise more broadly, this can really undermine the ability of experts and physicians to give their patients good advice that those patients will then follow. And of course, this has very terrifying implications for public health more broadly, right? As we've seen with the COVID-19 conspiracy theories, people refusing to take good medical advice to protect themselves and protect others in our society, because they believe that, you know, this is just COVID is a Jewish hoax, it's a Jewish conspiracy, or that the epidemiologists and the researchers who are trying to develop a vaccine are actually trying to harm us. And so as a result of that, they refuse to social distance, to wear masks and all these things. And it's led to a tremendous increase in the spread of this virus. So again, like I think that in a medical setting, you know, these kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, when they proliferate, they really undermine the work of the medical profession.
Right. And Lenore, I know you wanted to jump in and answer the previous question as well, but before I let you do that, we did get a question from Shanice Cox. Thank you, Shanice, for your question. The question is, she said, when I lived in Israel for 3 months to complete my theology dissertation, I decided to focus on the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Jewry. After gathering many narratives, I saw similar protests against discrimination and the need to prove their heritage. I wanted to know your thoughts on this topic. I know that during my visit that this is only a glimpse into an experience, but she would love to gain some insight. So I'm just going to open the floor up to anyone on our panel that would want to just give some insight into that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So there have been protests from the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel against perceived racism that exists certainly in Israeli society, just as it exists in our society here in the United States and exists in many other societies around the world. But it's also important to remember that most of the people who are, you know, part of these protests are also ardent Zionists. They are people who consider themselves to be Israelis, to be part of the Israeli society and part of the broader Jewish people. It's also important to remember the incredible sacrifices and difficulties that you know, Ethiopian Israelis underwent to get to Israel, right? Crossing the deserts by many miles, oftentimes on foot. And it's also important to remember that the state of Israel itself made tremendous efforts to bring Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia to their new home in Israel, as many of them wanted to actually live in the home of their ancestors. So racial issues continue to be a problem in Israeli society, and it's really important that they be brought to the fore so that the issues that continue to persist are dismantled, and so that all Israelis, just like all Americans, should be afforded the rights, as everybody else, and should be treated equitably under the law.
Lenore, I want to come back to you. You said you wanted to follow up on a previous thought from either Dr. Kaplan-Liss or Vlad's previous question about the cultural identifying things working with patients. What did you want to add to that portion of the discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Prescott. I was actually going to talk a little bit about the facilitating a conversation about anti-Semitism between people. As I mentioned earlier, we hosted a webinar for women of color. It took us about 2 years to do that. We knew it was an important topic and no one was doing it. And so what we did was we had 3 Black women who volunteered and 3 white women. And the only parameter is that you talk openly and honestly. And so we asked questions that people sent us before the webinar, and it was just a tremendous conversations because, again, everybody did talk openly and honestly. Nobody held back, and you learn from each other. And that's really the only way to find out, is to ask people what they're experiencing. And everyone on the panel learned, everyone in the audience learned. We've had over 25,000 people already watched that webinar because it was so powerful, and we plan on doing it again. So I'm going to make 2 suggestions. Either facilitate something like that if you want to learn about current day anti-Semitism and what people are experiencing. If you want to go back into history, bring in a Holocaust survivor. There's not many left. My dad just passed away last year. He was 94. So there's so few of them left. And they're the ones who are really going to give you that firsthand experience. My father always used to say, you can't learn it in a book. It's different when you actually talk to someone and when you can ask them your questions. So those are going to be my 2 suggestions for facilitating those conversations. And I think they're going to be extremely powerful and extremely educational.
Yes, history is so important, and tapping into older people before they pass away is so important. I have these conversations all the time with my aunts, with my grandmother. I got to talk to her about growing up before she passed away. So I completely understand your point and the logic of actually tapping into that history before it's gone, so that way we don't forget and we can continue to pass that along. Dr. Kaplan-Liss, since we're talking about having conversations, if a medical student feels singled out about a comment that they feel to be anti-Semitic in a medical school setting, what would be your advice to that student?
In our school, and I'm sure in many medical schools, there are many different paths to addressing this. And it's really about the comfort of the student. If they feel comfortable having a conversation directly, in that moment, I would approach it in a more yes and kind of conversation, which is basically, your goal is to educate, I would imagine, in a conversation like that, and not to agree necessarily with what they're saying, but to take it in and move the conversation along without putting up a stop sign, making the conversation continue. And that's a lot in these trainings that we do for diversity as well, in terms of conversations. But I would also encourage them to join with their, who they feel safe with in their community, and share this. And that may be their fellow students, that may be some of the coaches and other mechanisms we have in this medical school. I do just want to add on to and respond to what Lenore said about the Holocaust survivor stories. My visceral reaction and my feeling of being a part of Jewish history and anti-Semitism came through stories. That's what I heard and learned all through Hebrew school in my life, Holocaust survivors, family members, and that's what good communication is all about. We learn and communicate in stories, and stories is a huge foundation for what we teach in this medical school. So I would like to also encourage what LENORE is saying is to bring forth these stories, which gives knowledge, but also educates in a level playing field. So
I want to jump in also just to plug a couple of resources that we have on our website that I think would be useful. First is Hate Uncycled, which is a resource for campus administrators, college and university administrators, to help deal with some of these tough issues of anti-Semitism, racism, free speech versus hate speech on campus. You can find that at hateuncycled.org. Again, that's hateuncycled.org. And the second resource I want to plug is a resource for students on campuses who are dealing with some of these issues. And that resource is Think, Plan, Act, and it can be found at adl.org/think-plan-act.
All right, thank you, Vlad. And also we're going to put links to those resources that Vlad just listed in the comment section, so you guys can go back and read those. We did have another question that came in from Sam Evans. Thank you for your question, Sam. Dr. Kaplan Liss, the question is for you. And so Sam said, you mentioned that when you were doing some research and you were on Google, and one of the questions that popped up for you automatically was how to find a Jewish doctor. So Sam said, do you feel that this is more that they want a doctor who understands them on a deeper level? And if so, how as a non-Jewish physician can we make our patients more comfortable and make sure that they feel safe with us?
So that's, Sam, a really interesting question, because that was my dinner conversation last night with my family when I raised this issue, because you can look at it both ways. It could be I'm searching for somebody I can feel connected with, or if you are a glass half empty type of person, and I think I was in that mood yesterday, and that's totally not my MO, is, the stereotypes that go along with it. So that was our conversation at dinner last night. And the rest of the question was, how do we make our patients more comfortable? I don't think that stems from being Jewish or not. I think there is a compassion crisis in this country and between physicians and their patients. And that's why we're here at this medical school to hopefully move the dial on that. And it's the way you approach any conversation and any connection with a patient, no matter what their religion is, because a patient wants to be heard. They want their story to be told. And I don't think that matters no matter what religion you are.
Oh, thank you for that, Dr. Kaplan Liss. LENORE, I wanted to give you an opportunity to list some resources. And also, just if anyone's looking for trusted resources on anti-Semitism so they can better educate themselves about it, do you have any resources you can share with us?
My go-to resource is Vlad and the ADL. I hate to, I'm cross-promoting you here, but yeah, I think the ADL is really the best resource out there. When people in higher education ask me for resources, that's where I send them. So
Thanks,
they really
Lenore.
are the best.
I appreciate that. And if you're looking to find out more information and learn more about anti-Semitism, to understand some of the common tropes, I would recommend a new resource we put out called Anti-Semitism Uncovered. And you can access that at antisemitism.adl.org.
Nice. We also had another question that came in from Cindy Yang. Thank you for your question, Cindy. So her question is, she's a current applicant. Okay, Cindy. And she said, thank you for opening FWMD Live to the general public. Of course, we want everyone to be a part of these very important conversations, Cindy. So thank you for watching, and actually thank you for leaving a comment so we can get your question answered. So her question is, how do you combat against and address the ideology that dismisses anti-Semitic prejudice and discrimination as valid as other racial, ethnic, and cultural hate crimes. Vlad, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but that idea that, you know, saying something about Jewish people just because the stereotype is they have a lot of money or they're higher up in society, you can just attack them, and it's
Right.
not necessarily a negative thing. How do we address that idea again?
Well, first thing, I think people need to realize that anti-Semitism isn't just a phenomenon that hurts Jewish feelings, right? It's a phenomenon that threatens Jewish lives. And I'm not just talking about the Holocaust, which was, of course, a seminal event and you know, probably the most horrific culmination of anti-Semitism. But even just a few decades before the Holocaust, if you look at Eastern Europe, there were pogroms that swept, you know, these acts of mass anti-Jewish violence that swept across Eastern Europe and took the lives of 100 to 200,000 Jews, right? So it's a deadly phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon that has this kind of self-preservation mechanism built into it. I mentioned earlier that, you know, the conception of the Jew to the anti-Semite is somebody who is rich, powerful, and privileged. And for us, particularly in the United States, I think there's a conception that if you are rich, powerful, and privileged, you cannot be the victim of oppression, right? And so, you know, the questioner is right to note this this phenomenon where people dismiss or overlook anti-Semitism because they have kind of accepted the claim of anti-Semitism, which is that Jews are rich, powerful, and privileged, right? But it's important to remember that, like, you know, about 13% of all hate crime victims are Jewish, right? Despite the fact that Jews represent, you know, about 2% of the population, which is to say Jews are overrepresented among targets of hate crime by a factor of more than 6, right? So, you know, when we're talking about these prejudices, the other thing, you know, that it's really important to remember is that all of these things, as I mentioned, are interconnected, right? I want to plug a really incredible essay that was written by Eric Ward, who is a longtime civil rights strategist and researcher of white nationalism, where he explains the central role that that anti-Semitism plays in white nationalist ideology as the fuel that that animates the racism, the misogyny, these anti-immigrant xenophobia, and other forms of hate that white supremacy holds dear, right? So, for example, we saw the way that in Pittsburgh, which was the worst anti-Semitic act of mass violence in U.S. history, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the assailant, the white supremacist who walked into that synagogue and murdered Jews in prayer, said that the reason he was doing it is because Jews are flooding his country with non-whites, right? Which is to say that there's a nexus between this kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, anti-refugee rhetoric and anti-Semitism. One fuels the other. You cannot kind of look at anti-Semitism in a vacuum. You have to understand it as part of this broader matrix. So I suppose that's the answer that I would give to those who discount the seriousness of anti-Semitism.
All right, thank you for that, Vlad. I want to say that will actually do it for today's FWMD live chat. Thank you again to our wonderful medical students, HANNA MAKK, Paige Miller, and Alana Zago, and also our special guests, Dr. Captain Liss, LENORE PEARLSTEIN, and Vlad Heiken. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this important conversation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lenore. All right, so I want to thank everyone on Facebook for being a part of today's FWMD live chat. And also, let me tell you, I need you to join us next Thursday at 1 p.m., same time. We're going to have a group of students from our inaugural class of medical students last year who actually are a part of a 4-year project documenting their time at our medical school because they were the very first students at the TCU and UNT HSC School of Medicine. So that project is actually being done by TCU Magazine. And so we will have all 6 of the featured students on next week's live chat. And also we will have writer Lisa Martin, who has actually followed them for the past year, just to give some insight on what medical school has been like. here in Fort Worth. Also, the summer 2020 issue of TCU Magazine is actually available now, and you will see two of our medical students, Charna Kennard and Jonas Cruz, on the cover of that magazine. So if you get a chance, make sure you pick up a copy, take a read, and you can see what it is like to actually be a medical student at a brand new medical school. So join us next Thursday, 1 p.m. We'll have a live chat with all of those lovely students. So that's what's happening next week. This week, we had our conversation about anti-Semitism. Thank you for joining us. And thanks everyone for watching, and thank all of our guests. We will see you all next week.